Middle East, excluding Iran, has brought a few cases to the International Court of Justice. The case involving Qatar versus Bahrain regarding maritime boundaries in 2001 is the only quarrelsome case that has been filed at ICJ from the Middle East. Nonetheless, the case concerning Qatar versus the United Arab Emirates is one of the most recent cases from the Middle East to be filed at the ICJ. Therefore, it is worth following. The case is about the application of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which focuses on the elimination of racial discrimination and the raise of awareness and understanding among all races in the world. The dispute between Qatar and the UAE began when four countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt, accused Qatar of bankrolling and sponsoring terrorism in Yemen. The four states severed their diplomatic relationship with Qatar, as well as barred its airplanes from accessing the airspaces, thus causing Qatar to file a case at the ICJ. Qatar complained in its application before the ICJ that the UAE introduced and implemented many unfair and prejudiced measures against it and its citizens. Examples of these discriminatory measures included expulsion collectively of all Qatari nations forum, as well as barring the entry of Qatari citizens into the UAE. According to Qatar's application, the expulsion prohibitions were based on the country of origin of the Qataris. Additionally, Qatar claimed that the UAE violated other fundamental rights of Qataris, such as freedom of expression and opinion, right to education, work, and property ownership, right to medical care and public health, and the right to freely choose a spouse for marriage. Qatar also lamented about the violation of the Qataris' right to equal treatment before tribunals. Furthermore, Qatar indicated that the UAE had also avoided condemning racial hatred against its people. Instead, Qatar explains that the UAE encouraged the racial hatred allowed, promoted, supported, and funded a global anti-Qatar campaigns in the public and social media platforms. The UAE is also alleged to have closed down media stations associated with Qatar, such as Al Jazeera offices, and failed to offer efficient protection and remedies to Qataris to search for redress against the racial discrimination acts through the legal system and law enforcement agencies, resulting in the defilement of Articles 2 and Article 5. Prohibition of racial discrimination in the employment of various economic, civil, cultural, and social rights. Among others, Qatar filed the case against the UAE on June 5, 2018. Requestion for provisional measures. The ICJ on July 23, 2018 issued its order on provisional measures, directing the UAE to stop its family separation activities and instead ensure the unification of families. The court also ordered the UAE to follow the students which education and learning had been interrupted to continue with their learning or receive back their educational certifications so that they can continue their studies in other countries. However, on March 22, 2019, the UAE filed a request in the ICJ for provisional measures. The UAE's application led to different legal questions, with the proceeding initiated by Qatar on the CERD committee being the most important one. The case between Qatar and the UAE is a global issue because it involves two sovereign countries. The case cannot be heard under the judicial system of the two nations. Hence, it has been taken to the ICJ. Additionally, the subject matter of the case is a global concern. For example, racial discrimination is an issue in many countries around the world. Besides, the laws and policies that are of interest in the case applies internationally and were established by the international community. Examples of the policies include the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the 1944 International Air Services Transit Agreement, and the Convention on International Civil Aviation. Therefore, the case is of interest to many countries around the world. The court has taken various actions regarding the case. For instance, on July 23, 2018, upon the completion of public hearings regarding this case, ICJ ruled on the request for the indication of provisional measure that Qatar filed. The court first ruled on whether it had jurisdiction to hear and determine the case. The ICJ explained that it could only order for provisional measures only if the provisions depended on by Qatar seem without considering the facts and evidence of the application. To gain basis on which its authority could be instituted, the ICJ also clarified that Article 22 of the CERD mentions that its influence was restricted since it could only hear cases involving disagreements that could not be solved through negotiation or measures in the Convention. Additionally, the ICJ found that some of the acts that the UAE undertook on the Qatar and its citizens desecrated the CERD and established racial discrimination. Nonetheless, the case is continuous, and most recent development in the case involves the court's deliberations.